Hello everyone, today we talk about Anglo-Saxon warriors in a kind of a general way. We should talk about I would say, the middle infantryman. That is kind of, an aleatory picture to draw without tracing the boundaries of a bit of what we're talking about, the social classes, the specific training, the specific background of these people, right? And Anglo-Saxon England is one of the least documented areas in Western Europe at the time. Today we discuss essentially from the 7th to the 10th century, but we shouldn't make too much of a fuss about the lack of evidence, right? For example, some banally just armor, as we will see now. It arrived in basically just one exemplar or two, right, depending on body armor, and that gives you kind of a bit of the scale of how few we specifically know. But at the same time, there are so many analogies we can draw with other peoples, and also we can apply military logic here and there to understand a bit better. So today we talk chiefly about arms and armor, and yes, a bit of background about the as we've seen, the political and social side, but also addressing certain aspects of tactics that we will, however, discuss better in a dedicated video. Also, speaking of the Anglo-Saxon military organization that today we will refer to, in part because of differences such as the ones between the Thanes, the Sea Earls, and also the Hertberu, for example, and how these things essentially transitioned. I already made a video that is titled literally Anglo-Saxon military organization, so you can reference to that for at that point proper aspects of not just Anglo-Saxon organization, but also strategy, in part also tactics. But we will deal, as we were saying before, with the latter in a better, more properly dedicated video. But it's important, naturally, in military history to keep in mind the whole picture. Otherwise, you can't really fill the gaps that we of knowledge that we lack here and there. So we're talking essentially from the 7th to the 10th century. So let's say we're excluding the first phase of the settlement of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Also, we are essentially leaving out the Anglo-Danish period. That's so major political, military, as well as social transformation, and it basically changed pretty much the nature of Anglo-Saxon forces. So we're talking basically a bit about the early and all the middle Anglo-Saxon period in here, but we can't and we must trace connections, links mostly with the before, right? Even as back as realizing what Germanic warriors were about. Still, in order to at the beginning of the current eve to objectivize what they could be, in the late 6th, in the 7th century, right? So first of all, we have to get acquainted to the process of settlement in Britain that changed big deal in the original Anglo-Saxon society. That, as we know from documentary, narrative, and archaeological sources, was an armed society, like continental Germans were at the time. So this meant that all men were required initially to own arms and to know how to use them. Right, it was not even an option. Right, these men were normally living in conditions that would present them with the necessity of fighting. Most of it was really raiding warfare. It wouldn't evolve into something properly professional, but there were certain elite units, so-called war bands, that were essentially the retinues of the various leaders in a very politically fluid society where there wasn't much of verticization, much of a hierarchy. And this is reflected even just by the way the Anglo-Saxons settled in Britain. seemingly and realistically hired by the Romano-Britons, eventually taking over and settling in different groups so much that we talk, in fact, about the Angles, the Saxons, the Utes, and so on. And here we skip all the problem of understanding, who's who in terms of, the pre-existing British population eventually after the Anglo-Saxon settlement, because that's an important topic, but it's better left for another general history video. What is important is also trace, however, the difference between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic fringe a bit, as we will do, especially concerning the use of cavalry, which was quite fascinating in that regard. So in these societies, youths were presented with a shield and a spear by a chieftain or by a close relative. So this entailed a rite of passage to manhood, which in more primitive times consisted in a true traumatic, extremely violent, almost abusive event that was designed to essentially depersonalize the individual and to make it basically a retinue member of a greater power, that is the one that flowed from the deity of war into the lord, the chieftain, and that every member of the war band had basically to stick to with fanatic loyalty to the death, right? Because it would have been a political and social shame, and these people would have literally been marginated to death if they had showed any kind of cowardice, right? Naturally, the thing happened, things go. But let's say once you entered the club, right, you were fundamentally you didn't belong to yourself anymore. Naturally, most men were not part of these war bands. It would be mostly farmers and would have a different lifestyle. As we will see better already by the migration era, Germany had changed from the literally prehistoric times at the beginning of the millennium, and this suggests, however, the creation of a more specialized warrior class, in fact, that is difficult to distinguish in the societies that are fundamentally poor, not very stratified, from the rest of the freemen, but that still was used to fight in with the differences that eventually we find in Britain after the settlement. And Germanic chieftains, throughout their life, their deeds, gave out further weapons as gifts to valued warriors, partly from among the plunder gained by the warband. And this was an important clientele mean, because the supply of weapons became, through it, intimately connected with the oaths of loyalty to the Lord, right? It began to be ever more kind of the Lord/boss, and that would literally provide for you, right? As long as you were cohesive and functioning well under a capable leader, and energetic, aggressive-minded, and kind of fearless warriors who could in fact invade even country like post-Roman Britain, and this was literally at least a great part of the cement that held the Germanic warband together. The idea of the loot, of the redistribution of wealth, right? This naturally was aimed to eventually gain some more permanent forms of revenue. So that's also the part of the settlement, and naturally demilitarizes this lifestyle, simply because the advantages of a more civil life were kind of evident. But let's not underestimate how long, especially in Britain, in Anglo-Saxon Britain, such customs, and especially the clienterly aspect, is somewhat overlooked, but in front of the theatre, that attracts a bit the attention as an orderly organ, which was very, very important. The general levy in the Anglo-Saxon army, that however was ever more select, as it's called by modern historiography. In fact, it wasn't quite much properly the full levy of all able-bodied freemen, but something, let's say, more part-time, and let's say even just when and in fact selective when it was issued, and also ever more linked to land owning, and how the revenues from the land would work for these communities, and not much the only military kind of tribal nature of the early invaders. So an example of such forms of redistribution of wealth in a very generous way occurs in the Old English poem Beowulf, because when the hero successfully kills the monster Grendel, the Danish king Hrothgar rewards him with a golden standard, a helmet, a byrnie, a famous and costly sword, literally, 8 war horses with gilded bridles, one of them, quote, a skillfully decorated saddle, on one of them a skillfully decorated saddle with jewels that had been the High King's war seat. So this is a princely, if not a royal gift, right? These war bands, but were initially also very small, so and operating in areas that didn't have even a true loot this enormous wealth to be redistributed. But still, that a poem like Beowulf gives the idea of what the general model, the ambition of these warriors was, even properly from a moral point of view. So this was an enormous gift, and this rewarding system was typical of the Thanes that, if you remember, are these essentially a bit between like freemen and noblemen that have a semi-professional status. They're appointed as the military organizer at the local level of the Anglo-Saxon levy, and they often participate as the better armored of the infantry of the Fyrd. The same goes for the Ertverud, that is the original name of the bodyguard of the Anglo-Saxon chieftains that were instead much more elite indeed, and literally we can't think of them as properly professionals because fighting was literally the only thing they did in their life, and that they were politically and socially designed to have that specific role and specializing into it. In part, the same Fyrd contains this idea of clienterly relation because the land is somewhat also given, right? Somebody has conquered it, and eventually the people that were under the chieftains were settled there. Men serving in the Fyrd were required to bring their own weapons. So the idea was a duty and a privilege at the same time to even have the right of bearing weapons, because that equated you to a freeman. However, we lack, differently from other Romano-Germanic countries at this point, of the actual Anglo-Saxon Fyrd equipment requirements. They will have not. They weren't that different probably from the rest of Europe. Let's say we can make a comparison with the Carolingian armies that require for 5 monthly owners as an obligation, quote, each one shall have a lance, shield, bow with 2 strings, 12 arrows, then let them have breastplates or helmets and let them proceed to the army, that is, in the summer. Right, and it's commonly believed that at this point, this is the capital of Aachen, that is from the very early 9th century, that the Anglo-Saxons on average would have a slightly worse equipped infantrymen at that point. That, as we'll see, basically the Fyrd was mostly about infantry, right? The Carolingian world was very different, was much more stratified socially. It was already essentially feudal in nature, like even if it's an excessive word given, but compared to Anglo-Saxon England, let's say wealth was concentrated in the hands of much fewer people. The Fyrd, in spite of the ups and downs it had until 1066, was after all, a functional system that reflects, in a way, the more evenly distribution of wealth in Anglo-Saxon England, not because England was richer than, I don't know, most Carolingian-held areas, but because simply wealth was more evenly distributed. So part of the reason, even in there, why we commonly believe the Anglo-Saxons didn't make much use of cavalry when we come back on this is actually because the freemen retained a greater individual, in fact, capacity, power, freedom proper than in many areas of the continent, especially the Frankish-dominated ones. So as far as the equipment is concerned, we can think, yes, of a slightly less amount of wealth, maybe from an individual point of view, but there were more numerous, right? And the basic equipment is really lance, shield, bow. We'll talk about the bow later because there's not a dramatic evidence of that, of a widespread use in Anglo-Saxon England, but still it existed, and I personally think it might have been overlooked, like also in the Celtic fringe, etc. It's not because you don't have an evidence that especially the bows are not to be found, even archaeologically, that often, and if you lack documentation, that basically doesn't tell you anything of how it was really like. But let's say since the migration era, but even from previous times, and that's also overlooked, like especially the more numerous, less equipped troops, poorer troops would be equipped with bow and quiver, with arrows on a regular base. But anyhow, we only have a later specification for the Thane equipment in the early 11th century in the laws of Ethelred, and that basically tell us what kind of an average Thane, so something that was actually better than the average Anglo-Saxon warrior, had to be equipped like. That is, a helmet, a mail shirt, a gold-plated sword, and this is already happening at a time in which the Viking invasions and the increasing privatization of power had already quite unbalanced the Anglo-Saxon society, and especially had properly disarmed a great many of people, of freemen that before would have been more capable of even just defending themselves, because the Anglo-Danish military organization was ever more, professional in the figures of the huscarls, etc. Even the figure of the Thane itself, but kind of entered in crisis. You can think of even of the lesser troops. There is another interesting clienterly dynamic in Anglo-Saxon England, which is the Heriot, or death duty. This was essentially a tax on the dead, on the dead Thane specifically, that brought the heirs of the dead to pay to the king, for whom they held as a Thane family the land they occupied, a certain amount of essentially weapons and military equipment. And over time this was replaced by a cash payment, of course made things much easier, and that reveals naturally the increase of professionalization over time towards the end of the period. And the point is naturally that when the Thane died, the king wouldn't lose an armed man, right? And this is interesting because from one side it tells you still the individual importance of Thanes for the kings, and in the Anglo-Saxon army, in this important, in the Firth, and still it reveals, in fact, as we've just said, the transition to a more professional system, because at that point the purpose of this donation was to perpetuate the contract with the king. That is to say, if you didn't pay this weapons and military equipment, you were not you were not a Thane family anymore, so you couldn't technically even enjoy the benefits, the authority that these figures embodied. Right, so this also naturally depended on the king, that all in all had a bit of an interest to disarm the population at large and to rely on ever more professional and private retinues. So the weapons could be reissued perhaps to under-equipped feared members if the general levy was found to be, let's say, ill-equipped, or to mercenaries, more often in the employ of the king himself. And by the end of the 10th century, the heriot of a king's thane was specified as actually a quite important amount of wealth, because we're talking about 4 shields, 4 spears, 4 horses, including 2 with saddles, 2 swords, a helmet, and a coat of mail. Right? This is not definitely the equipment of a single guy, but rather of a small sub-unit. And in practice, we're talking about the end of the 10th century, so we are in a moment where that process of privatization and professionalization had already kicked in. Reveals a little bit the kind of the, I know feudalization is a strong word, but in Anglo-Saxon England it never happened, right, until the Normans conquered proper. But let's say it was rare to find a family, an individual thane that could afford all this equipment, right? It costed a freaking lot. The horses, the swords, it's kind of the coat of mail. This is the equipment of a subunit that seems to have been part of already probably the retinue of the same thanes that were becoming something bit greater than just individual warriors. Had already become, actually. And that also, as we were saying before, also reflect what the kings demanded for them, and therefore to keep other people evenly. And were interested specifically in the weapons, in the horses, right? So also this especially reveals the importance of horses in Anglo-Saxon warfare, which is deeply overlooked. What's the deal about that? We talked about it already sometimes. So many like to stress the difference that existed between, let's say, the continental Germans at large and eventually the Anglo-Saxons in terms of, respectively, a substantial use of cavalry by the migration era time and the apparent lack and or, let's say, not employment in combat for the latter. First of all, let's consider that peoples like the Anglo-Saxons, like kind of the Northwest Germans, were among the Germanic peoples that made the least use of cavalry. They did use it, indeed, right? But least use means not just less cavalry, quantitatively speaking, but properly a more individual use of cavalry. Like in all these peoples, in all Indo-European peoples, the idea that the freeman was ideally a horseman had never abandoned anybody. This was true in Western Europe, where basically most people would regularly, and most freemen would always fight on foot. But this idea was proper of everybody, was proper of the Romans, of the Celts, of the Germans, right? They remembered their Caucasian past, the idea of their mythologies, in their divine figures of war, that the horse was already around, in a sense. If you look at the Vendel era, you see there the hero is always on horseback, right? And here we're talking basically about the same time, right? Many, at least Anglo-Saxons, came not just from the Jutland, the other areas of Germany. Jutland at that time can be considered still Germany, but also from Scandinavia, from Sweden, from Norway, etc. And we see the parallel there very, very clearly. But that doesn't mean that cavalry was that dramatically developed. The same goes a bit like for the Vikings. There were good horses, like in Denmark. There were also, good breeds, but simply the availability was and the actual employ was lower. for the simple reason that, as we were saying before, freemen in these societies that were less stratified than others had still, an important power over the elites. So the deal, we've seen it also, for example, with the Alemanni at the Battle of Strasbourg, right? The nobility regularly fought on horseback, but they were literally obliged by the freemen for the internal political balance to dismount, to fight with the other guys in the phalanx, to prevent that they could flee, because fleeing on horseback might have been a good way to essentially leave the rest of the bulk of the freemen to die there on their own, and this would have even in the defeat of the tribe would have dramatically strengthened the elites, and this is what they wanted to avoid, right? But of course, they were acquainted to Western capacities, individually speaking, also dramatically, collectively not so much for all these reasons. Consider that also marshy areas, like altogether you can find along the North Sea, where even just with the weather, etc., were, like in Britain, historically, were not great for horse breeding, for cavalry, probably for matters of terrain, right? So these are also important factors. Until Norman times, it wasn't a big deal by Western tradition in Britain. Caesar, back in the day, does refer of the Britons employing not just chariots, but properly cavalry, and we know they did, right? And also we have all this evidence, these hints that Anglo-Saxons surely did at the same time, but there were political reasons for not quite using it more than much, right? They also never quite met with peoples that made a dramatic use of cavalry warfare until Norman times. They surely were heavily influenced by Frankish, by the Frankish military culture at some level, but still their society was different, right? It was differently equilibrated. It, not surprisingly, before the Norman conquest, England shared more like with Scandinavia, like countries like that than continental Europe in that regard. Things changed naturally afterwards, a big deal, but it's not our time now. This fact that probably Anglo-Saxons didn't make such a great use of cavalry quantitatively already before the migration in Britain is helpful to understand how we shouldn't that be surprised. And eventually also in Britain there wasn't much use of cavalry in Anglo-Saxon times. And the usual deal is that these cavalrymen were used to reach the battlefield on horseback and eventually dismounting to fight. This is to be found in many places in Europe, even where the vassalic beneficiary system had kicked in, right? Even Carolingian cavalry that had the strongest cavalry in Western Europe surely dismounted on a regular basis. The same Normans did at the time of the conquest of England. They weren't already the heavy, highly collectively trained shock cavalry and thickly, compacted and kind of standardly drilled couché-length chargers. That would happen in a couple of centuries to fully mature that. So we shouldn't be so surprised, right, about the fact that infantry in the field was prevalent. It had been so throughout all the ancient times. Like the increasing importance of cavalry during the migration era is evident, but cavalry was not quite prevalent as an arm, right? It was not decisive. It wouldn't become until the second half of the 12th century. So it's perfectly normal to find still this balance of infantry being also properly effective. Like if these guys do not want the nobility to increase the gap by exploiting their wealth advantage by fighting on horseback, they can impose it with their own arms. At the same, they can go against enemy cavalry right on the battlefield. It's basically the same thing. The Anglo-Saxons in this century is mostly until the late 8th century, they basically only fought against each other. Against the Celts as well, that had more cavalry than them. But in as we'll see in the linear progress, it seems that Anglo-Saxon cavalry capacities actually increased over time, and for a reason of social stratification, not much, and or because, yes, also external influence, but not for other dramatic changes that happened there. It was a kind of a natural process. Consider all Romano-Germanic kingdoms went towards that, right? Doesn't matter, we tend to stress too much the differences. We rightly point out the Carolingians had the first properly professional cavalry in Europe, there in Western Europe, but let's say other peoples like, in fact, the Visigoths, the Longobards, etc., they didn't have that professional system, but they still, their societies were evolving towards single guys having ever more wealth and the majority of guys having ever less wealth, and that meant that they could afford ever more to fight on horseback, right? So it's a common trend in these countries, and so it is in Anglo-Saxon England, and as we will see how it happened. So an Anglo-Saxon warrior of the 5th and 6th century would be primarily an infantryman, right? We never find horses and horse furniture in graves that also include weapons. As we were saying before, the marshy coasts of eastern England, where the Germanic tribes first settled, were not that great for horse riding and breeding. And it seems, actually not surprisingly, that the Romano-Britons at their arrival had more cavalry than the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, there is even at some point in the Anglo-Saxon royal household, a corps of messengers known as the Horsebellas, that means basically Welsh horsemen, that would have been theoretically native Britons, distinguished from the Germans, and this is explainable through the fact that yes, there was surely a Roman legacy that the Romano, in fact, Britain military organization naturally had maintained some equestrian let's say availability, etc. And most of this knowledge fled towards the fringe, the Celtic fringe, and survived on. As far as the Picts are concerned, well, we know historically they, since Caledonian times, actually, Scotland had actually the best cavalry in Britain. So even in there, the continuity of with the elites, etc., remained, with the various clan leaders, etc., remained oriented towards use of cavalry as well, even if there too infantry was prevalent. And some revival of Anglo-Saxon cavalry is to be witnessed in the 9th century. That, as you understand, is also a bit the blooming of Carolingian cavalry across the Channel, but also of the Viking raids into English territory. And Vikings did use horses even in large numbers. Actually, I don't even understand properly why we think that Vikings made a scarce use of cavalry. That they actually did, right, and properly also in combat. It's just they weren't as collectively trained as the continental Frankish cavalry. This is clear. But as far as numbers are concerned, and also the various zootechnical and general equestrian know-how, well, this probably, yes, did have an impact on Anglo-Saxon England as well. But I presume not much because of, let's say, an injection of horses, of cavalry techniques in the island. Rather because of the intensification of warfare proper that brought to this important Anglo-Saxon military fort, and therefore generally because of the devastations, the military strains, etc., to deprive most freemen also of their actual resources, and therefore even in there the Anglo-Saxon army began to rely ever more on more kind of professional troops, or semi-professional, let's say better. So much actually we find Anglo-Saxon kings establishing centralized stud farms to have a greater horse availability. This is definitely very important. From one side, there is a territorialization of the militia, of the feared. Think about the burghs that are created properly as a territorial force. Yes, after the 10th century, it seems they declined because at that point the Anglo-Danish border was so extended that it kind of didn't have much sense anymore. But there was the idea that military service at that point had been territorialized at the point that just for living in some place you were kind of like a military colony and you were not called for the army, and this would always be more the so-called select feared of that could at that point kind of even live off the land if you a bit like in Carolingian Europe, right? There was just one guy that went to war and out of 3, and the other 2 paid for his equipment, right? So you had a smaller but, let's say, more qualitative force that you could also support with the resources of those who remained home, right? And especially to meet with the Viking raids at that point were kind of a freaking mess. But the Anglo-Saxon system held, and that is also fascinating at that point. Eventually blended into the so-called the Anglo-Danish one, but still there was some, and there probably cavalry was increased importantly. Also, we know that the church that at this point had taken a firm root in England and acquired important wealth was responsible for the maintenance of horses, such as in the case of that we find in 875 with the King Ceolwulf of Mercia that issued that lifted at that point actually the responsibility of maintenance of horses in the diocese of Worcester that at that point had provided them. So we are fairly sure, given the Harriet especially, that many individual thanes must have owned horses, right, which they rode on personal on a royal business during peacetime, right? We just get the impression that they were not too keen to use them, or even sometimes even to take them into battle. But this actually doesn't have much to do. It speaks for limited equestrian capacities of Anglo-Saxon armies, but it doesn't actually say that individual Anglo-Saxon wars were stranger to mounted warfare, mounted combat, right? So it was surely more common than we think, and I personally don't think there was any say true conservatism about that, because actually the thanes were those who were seeking for more social promotion, right? They weren't actually caring so much about maintaining the older balance of the freemen. They were the first ones that were essentially profiting from it. So I don't really believe in conservatism. I really believe of a shortcome of actual structural possibilities to field large amounts of collectively and thus effectively trained cavalrymen, right? In a system that, as is normal in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, with the only exception of Carolingian cavalry, a non-professional one. So you can't ask too much. Also, England is not so big or heavily populated. Also, the actual capacities of the people. If you look at the feared numbers from the various books that eventually were written to issue the services, we will see that theoretically, yes, they included, as in all countries, all the able-bodied freemen. So we talk also tens of thousands of men, but the actual capacity of levying them for political, in terms of political capacity from the side of kings, and properly the structural possibilities of society were much lower. But this is kind of obvious. I don't know. The strain of the Anglo-Saxon army in 1066, first against the Norwegians and then against the Normans, it was, massive, something enormous. And you got to admit there that surely, however, they knew how to make things work. But that was also another time, actually. Speaking of arms and armor, I mean, the early Germans were equipped with, mostly very few armor, and mostly had lances, few swords, and etc. We know, though, that during the migration era, things had changed a little. At least that there is the emergence of a more specifically military class, right? The Eisböll find in southern Jutland shows us an important material wealth, right? It is still, overall very, very, very scarce, but that in that case we have this bog with this huge amount, talking about several hundred weapons left there. That was probably a devotion to the gods of war of an exterminated enemy arm, right? And that speaks for what could be the amount of armament of in fact of an army from the areas in which more or less the Anglo-Saxons came from. It was a normal Germanic practice to offer the spoils of the enemy to the gods of war in exchange for victory. It was done by many peoples, actually, as a fulfillment of vows made to the gods before the battle. And the Eisböll Ord contains essentially a basic weapon set of spear and shield for about 180 warriors. The commonest spear type is a broad-headed variety that is not much made for throwing, suggests rather a more, closely arrayed formation that what the Germans in the previous centuries actually used. The javelins used primarily as missile weapons are also present, right? And more or less they were one per warrior. Before, the Germans would use mostly the so-called frame, as Tacitus says, something that was a javelin / spear, right? As most warriors in antiquity were. It doesn't, literally doesn't make any sense to distinguish a spear from a javelin because they were used exactly in the same way. Here, there begins to be a split, right? Which reflects, let's say, a greater tactical specialization and a more, and thus a greater political social development that is able to confer a bit of a greater organization training for these troops. Also, out of these 180 sets, we have 60 swords. So basically one sword every 3 warriors. And this is especially the main indicator of the emergence of an elite class before the Anglo-Saxon migration. Also, there are 675 arrowheads found at Eisböll, right? Which is not surprising considering the times, and the fact that we don't see much use of archery in Anglo-Saxon England can be simply the fact that we don't have eventually anything like the Eisböll find, right? And also, as we know, with time, Christianization, Anglo-Saxons were not buried like other peoples anymore with weapons as it was used in pagan times. So the cemeteries that have been excavated in England show us a much less militarized society than the German one, right? So the percentages here of number of weapons, swords, axes, and so on are of relative importance, because very often we don't know whether, the fact that a warrior wouldn't be buried with a sword, with a axe, etc., doesn't actually tell us whether he would have actually used them in life. The point, though, is that we see much less equipment buried, and this, generally speaking, means a greater, say, a lesser degree of militarization in these societies than they were before, right? And for the rest, this cemetery's finds reflect broader dynamics. I mean, the fact that, I don't know, warriors buried with a sword were usually higher in wealth and status. We find actually very few, like less than 2% of times, archery equipment and axes. But again, this doesn't quite mean that on the battlefield those would have not been used. We have 1/10, let's say, of the graves displaying the Saxons, etc., in different proportion among the Angles, the Saxons, and the youths. But and we can definitely trace even about this distribution actually external influence. Like, for example, in Kent, that was the most open and the richest area. The southeast in general, that was the most advanced area, was more open to Frankish imports across the channel. So we find more swords there because the Franks from the Rhineland exported them as the greatest center of arms production in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. So it doesn't quite necessarily tell there about an original proportion of the distribution of swords and so on. And again, this is just a burial, so we don't actually know how these men went at war like. And we rely on actually very few archaeological finds of complete panoplies. For example, one is the Bentigrange farm in Derbyshire, where it's been excavated a warrior's grave containing a helmet, various other precious items in what at the time, it was in 1848, they thought it was kind of a body armor, but it's probably something else, like a chain for a cauldron. But the most important finding here was the helmet. It was decorated with a curious mix of pagan and Christian emblems. We've seen just recently made videos about the Christianization on the Anglo-Saxons. It was a great hybrid. On this helmet you have a stilized boar of about 4 inches long mounted on the top of the helmet, and a silver crucifix on the nozzle. This is kind of fascinating. It dates to probably the mid-7th century. Right, this was a moment of actually intense warfare, but also spread of Christianity, and it tells you more or less what the hybrid also beliefs of these people actually were. Naturally, they had the symbols had an apotropaic / talismanic value by themselves. They thought they would be protected in combat by such spirits. Like we'll see it better also with the Sutton Hoo find, which in fact. It's very famous. It's been found in East-Anglia in 1939. The burial took place in the 7th century, and it has this spectacular armor that is, in fact, the only complete one we have from Anglo-Saxon times. It's dramatically similar to the Valsgärde Vendel culture in central Sweden in the beginning of the 6th century. Probably the Sutton Hoo armor was, passed down over the generations. Well, it was a clear symbol of royalty because the word burial, as you know, it's the ship. This still idea of coming from the sea, the water, also in Germanic kingship as a very important, let's say, spiritual / magic symbol. And it's believed to have belonged to Ethelred of East-Anglia that died at Battle of fighting for Pend. That point, the Sutton Hoo armor is not the one the king died with, but rather, one that was used possibly for ceremonial purposes, but we don't have to be too dogmatic about that. These things were, doesn't matter how elaborated, decorated they were, they would be used in combat as well, right? But it was probably part of a broader, let's say, set of arms and armor, as we have seen the ones that the kings used to gift their clients with, and here we're talking also very high level of royalty across Anglo-Saxon England as well. So they could be very precious diplomatic gifts, and it's of enormous value. We have also a beautiful shield with it. We'll talk about this in a while. And the Benthic range and Sutton Hoo armors are unique examples. That's how few we literally know there. They were surely too expensive to have been used by the bulk of warriors. There is no doubt about this. And so as for our average Anglo-Saxon warrior, he would have gone to battle basically for most of this period with like a shield and a spear. Literally. Perhaps a javelin for throwing before contact, which is often overlooked. But only richer individuals would have had swords. And in larger number, the Saxons as well. The Sax could really vary, it's basically a long knife, constitutively, that in the longest cases that found in Longobards Italy could reach like up to 70 centimeters. But in the cases, like that is a saber, right? But normally they were kind of small, even just tools, not just weapons, let's say better. But it could be very useful also in combat at close range, etc. Especially in contexts where, as we've seen, there was a few armor. So the human body is literally insignificant. You can't penetrate it just a few centimeters, and hitting major vessels and a knife is good for that, especially if you're kind of grappled like wrestling. Would be very physical fights, of course. So now we will take a deeper look at this kind of equipment. As far as helmets are concerned, before the 11th century we know almost nothing. We just have the Benthic range helmet, the Sutton Hoo one, and also the more recently discovered Coppergate type. And all are built up from shaped and riveted ferrous metal components. There is no Anglo-Saxon helmet of one-piece construction. This was just apparently a Central European thing. Later sources show something interesting, and at least we have to understand, of course, that these finds which we just listed are kind of, very expensive items, right? Especially the first two. And those are the ones that are more likely just to have survived materially, to be preserved too. From literature, we also get most of this bright examples. For example, just to cite Beowulf again, Beowulf himself is described to be wearing, quote, a shining helmet decorated with rich ornament, encircled with a ringed mail guard, just as the weaponsmith had wrought it in the days of old and wonderfully formed it, set about with boar images, so that thereafter no sword or battle blade might bite into it. Right, so here the reference to the boar image and its talismanic power is kind of very, it matches with archaeological evidence, but also with other dimension in other Anglo-Saxon poems, contemporary illustrations, right? So there would be this kind of animal brotherhoods, right? We usually, the war bands we were talking about before in pagan times were devotees to deities that were thought to be, let's say, materialized into these kind of animals that would confer kind of strength to the warrior, kind of take it on. Think about the berserkers, things like that, the wolves. There is a great of this symbolism, also well into Christian times, as we were saying before, in Anglo-Saxon England. Think about crows, also this all these anthropophagous animal, necrophagous animals actually, that devour the corpses of the warriors after the battle, and therefore are thought to be taking their soul in, under. And the also, for example, the crest of the Sutton Hoo helmet itself is an animal, but it's more like a snake, albeit it definitely has stylized bristles and a pig-like snout. So these were also kind of fantastic animals if we're considering, with hybrid characteristics and so on. And I was saying that those war bands were usually also, kind of characterized by different animals, and these things evolved sometimes even into clans, even at certain totemic level. In part, look even at the same onomastics. I mean, Beowulf simply means bear, like it's the wolf of the bees of honey, right? So it's the bear, and it's like the berserker, right? And we've made a video about that. So in Anglo-Saxon England, such ideas would survive for a long time, right? They would be used, even just the same migration era symbolism here. And if you think about the Draco standard, right? That wouldn't disappear in Europe up to the 13th century, 14th century. In Anglo-Saxon England, we find it even in 1066 and the Bayeux Tapestry. You see the Anglo-Saxons having this kind of monster symbolism in there that was typical of this background. Also, the swords were believed to be the alter ego of the warrior, literally in terms of virility and strength and so on. So much in Beowulf, again, the hero borrows the sword Hrunting, right, for his fight with Grendel, and Hrunting means roaring, right, roarer. This was supposed to be the sound the sword made when whirled in the air. So also the technique that stood behind the quality of these swords, and there was all a kind of a hierarchy of quality in this regard, naturally, was believed to be, delivering some magic power within the same sword, right? The connection with the underworld through the smiths, through the idea of, metals coming from the underground, all the forces that permeated that. Also, all the decorations on these arms and armor were reflecting the great visions of the world, these threads, there's intertwined symbolism, the unitary vision of the universe, of the strengths that are related, and so on. Also, sometimes this sword would be so important as to have almost a totemic value. For example, in his old age, Beowulf used the dynastic blade of the Jadish kings, the Negling, right? That etymologically suggests it was meant as a sword capable of cutting through metal nails. So you see here some kind of also properly even beast-like reference to. But again, what were Anglo-Saxon swords like? Well, they were basically the typical broad-bladed, two-edged form, typical of northwestern Europe until the 13th century, right? Anglo-Saxon swords were only slightly tapering, and this would increase over time, right? So it's a bit like the Roman gladius. At the beginning, there is a more individualistic form for which you need more slashing, so you don't need the sword to be just tapering, but just to be straight, long, and cutting, right? Eventually, in the later Anglo-Saxon period, you find Anglo-Saxon the sword becoming more tapering, suggesting kind of a more, let's say, aimed, piercing kind of type of orientatively use. Still cutting, of course, but let's say a blade that would be ever more designed to kind of hit more precisely, also by thrust in the spots that would be left open among the between the armor, right? That was coming to be ever more spread, at least better. The guys who fought were ever more professional, and therefore were ever better equipped and needed this kind of swords that weren't just about cutting but also thrusting more consistently. But the change over time all throughout Anglo-Saxon period is slight. Most swords were 4 or 5 centimeters broad, and the widest point of later blades below the crossguard was still about 4.5 centimeters, so the tapering didn't influence that more than much. Blades were constructed by the pattern welding technique that was there since the first centuries of Common Era. Naturally, it would be also this meant you welded, you hammered, welded, or twisted sections of different grades of steel to produce intertwining patterns along the blade. There were also less elaborated blades, right? For one blade it was super cool. There would be other 9 that sucked. This is typical of pre-industrial times, but still, with our own technology today, our dramatically advanced metallurgic capacities, we still can't make swords as they did for the ergonomy of combat probe, right? Because they knew definitely better than us what a combat was at the time. There were other, let's say, also building techniques, but this is not, as far as the actual employment, it's of relative importance. Saxes also were were the single-edged knives, as we were saying before. They could come into a variety of forms. Some of the longest ones in later times, like in the 9th and 10th centuries, were very long, actually up to 90 centimeters. I think this might be longer than Longobards ones, but these are kind of properly more like swords, I think, evolved. But I'd like to see actually the finds, because that interests me. In all this, given that we're given about the average Anglo-Saxon warrior, definitely the overwhelmingly more common weapon, guess what? It's the spear, right? The spear has dramatic advantages overall. The way you actually fight it with a sword reveals your higher status / capacity, better armament, etc. But it's the combination of all of this that actually makes you fight against a spearman in an effective way. But the overall, in terms of collective training of larger groups, formations, how the Anglo-Saxons fought in open field, still is it's the cheapest. To say in terms of cost effect, let's say for the average fighter, it's the best weapon. That still was a big deal, used, for terms of knowing how to use it for all warriors, even for the elite, right? The spear is also, say, in the Germanic tradition, the name. It actually gave the name to the people, practically, and to the army, etc. But naturally, the swords are the product, as we were saying, of something more articulate that comes with also other capacities that have not much to do just with the weapon in itself. And spears, as we were saying before, could be both the thrusting and throwing type, right? It would be an intermediate medium, so that it could be used either as a missile or close combat weapon. And spear construction at the time of Anglo-Saxon invasion followed essentially 2 main typologies. One was the broad-bladed spearhead, right? It's designed to create massive wounds, actually, and to be pretty nasty in that regard. The other one, into hand-to-hand combat, the other one is the throwing spear. What was known as the Beber is fundamentally a heavy javelin, like the Angon, right? It's like the Roman pilum. They had at this time basically the same degree of penetrativity. And the Angon remains in Anglo-Saxon use at least until the mid-7th century, as in most other countries that used it. And even in here, most of the reason why it kind of disappears, it's also because Christian burials began to take over. So actually these kind of throwing, like, have heavy javelins, kind of also pretty nasty stuff designed to penetrate armor in some cases, as are to be found here and there. During the Viking era, you find these kind of heavy javelins. In Finland especially, there's a tradition that goes on for many centuries of kind of more this type of combat that would decline eventually with the increasing importance of mounted combat, of heavier equipment, etc. But it's still a big deal. Like, consider that even other forms of blades, like there are huge, we're talking about single edged blades, about like saxes, etc. But Viking, some Norse sources speak of it in certain massive blades, like kind of falxes, something huge, like chopping. Most people would be unarmored, so that would be the best, like the chopping party, especially for the elite that was armored, right? That's typical, and simply taking down. Double hand axes, of course, also would be around, especially after the Viking invasions, and they probably were there as well, because actually the so-called Danish axe seemingly wasn't Danish at all. Like, it's just a later attribution, but these things mostly were born in a continental context where armor was more spread, and that eventually passed to the elites of these other countries that kind of lived longer enough with that individualistic ethos to have a guy with a double hand axe to go into the midst of the fray and, cutting people, chopping people around, and having other countries, starting to produce more sources to document them. So we kind of get our perspective falsified, right? It's like even the throwing axe. It's not a Frankish thing. See, it was actually a Roman one. And because wherever you find these traumatic weapons, it's because there is armor around. So, and the countries that had more armor at this point were in continental Europe, not quite in the north, proper. But these Angons, etc., had the just like the pilum, this capacity of bending on impact. So hopefully rendering useless the shields where they impacted, or creating dramatically messy wounds that would infect, and some of them were barbed, had a barbed head, so that properly would smash into the tissues and make enough oxygen enter to infect the wound, and most people actually died because of septicemia rather than because of bleeding out, right? At the time, they didn't really have many ways to cope with that. And naturally, the type of heads changed somewhat depending on the use you wanted to make. Shields. Now, shields were constructed of wooden planks that points refer as to have been made of linden, that is lime wood. The face was normally covered with stout cow hide. The laws of Ain prohibit against very harsh punishment to use sheep hide, but this in itself declares that actually such inferior material was more common, right? And at the end of the day, many people here at this point would be resistant to the levy, wouldn't quite like the idea of going to war. They would try at least to economize on the equipment, hoping maybe to go to sneak out. But anyhow, the simplest kind of shield boss was made from a flat sheet of iron, cut and folded to create a straight-sided cone with a flanged base. Then 4 holes in the flange allowed the boss to be riveted into the shield face. Anglo-Saxon period bosses were always of iron, right? Copper, alloy, and gold appear only as decorations to fittings. There were also other complex cone-shaped bosses, especially during early and middle Anglo-Saxon periods, which actually suggest a more aggressive fencing, right? The boss was used offensively, could literally, if you smash it into somebody's face, if it has point, it can be pretty bad. The Saturn Who shield, but there was also a kind of a status thing attached, like the larger the boss, also the more attractive in appearance, the more expansive. So yeah, but still it was about knowing how to use the shield in a very dynamic way. In fact, the early Anglo-Saxon shields actually suggest that they were smaller, like in diameter, than the later ones, and this suggests a more individual fencing. So people were used to fight in less dense formations than would be later on, right? And this actually doesn't mean that these warriors were individually less skilled, quite the contrary. right? It's because the shield wielding itself, it's not, first of all, it's the spears that make the job done mostly, but it's properly mostly about people that have to remain in formation, right? So that you can also that focus more on the collective training rather than the individuality, right? The hyper tough guy, hyper trained Huskarl, etc., would go with his shield in his back, and chopping, the shield wall in the front with a double-handed axe, stereotypically, right? Of course, they could fight in any, and they would fight in any way, but still, don't think that a shield wall makes, the participants of it kind of more individually capable than a guy who was able to fight kind of alone, right? The shield wall especially works with flat shields that do not quite actually that reveal that those who use them are to find information, not quite alone, right? Because otherwise it would be more convex, like, I don't know, Carolingian cavalry shields would be literally enveloping the shoulder of the wearer, or like the Roman scutum, or that would be, designed for an individualistic fencing. In spite, the guys knew how definitely to fight information. So let's not confuse things here. The shield wall itself, it's not a big deal. It was literally used by basically any people, and especially by the average infantry, as the regular, that's what you should be doing. It's about the cohesion. The Saturn Who shield is probably based on Central Swedish models, maybe an import, right? And it has a metal rim, in this case of soft copper alloy, which unit here suggests a parade armor, right? While most Anglo-Saxon shields probably had rims made of treated leather. Speaking of mail shirts, as we were saying before, we have evidence naturally of, and there's no, every people used mail shirt at this time. Old English literature reference frequently of Byrnes, mail shirts. But the only example that we have seen surviving properly is the one of Sutton Hoo. And the Sutton Hoo mail shirt is made in a pretty standard way, with metal rings, each one linked to 4 neighboring rings. The only kind of exceptional character of it is that the rivets sealing each link are made of copper, right? We have other surviving pieces of mail, such as the neck guard of the 8th century Coppergate helmet that were usually riveted with iron. There are also other ways, the neck guard rings rows could be hammered, welded to solid circles rather than riveted proper. We have later evidence, but not much of early Middle Anglo-Saxon times. Speaking of bows, as we were saying before, this weapon was probably more spread than we think. Most Anglo-Saxons would be farmers, and being pretty well acquainted to the use of bow hunting, which is a very different thing of kind of a specialized use of bow, especially in collective training, when you have to shoot kind of with the same rhythm at the same time to maximize the single, in interest of time, the concentration of the impact of multiple volleys at a time, which is what actually makes the archery effective on the field. Surely there would be more, let's say, individual type of bows using the elites knew pretty well how to use them. Some of the early Anglo-Saxon bands would be small as literally tens of thousands of warriors. So in that context, individuality is much more important. You can use a bow also in more kind of I wouldn't even know to say that, but equilibristic way, we could improperly say, so as to be precise and to, I don't know, struck somebody into freaking eye. But altogether, there is no evidence of large bodies of substantially collectively trained bowmen that could specialize into, no. We just have, as usual, variety of bows based on the size of the people who use them. That is, longbows exist in Britain since 2500 BC Somerset, so there is really no surprise there. But there is no sign of specific specialization of massed archery, right? But still, probably large numbers were out there, and we just don't see them much, right? Remember that the sources are always biased. They even in Germanic military culture, you see that in the sagas, in the epic, heroes always get killed in kind of nasty, inglorious ways, because that reflects the tragic, idea of the world, of the of destiny. And there's always some kind of knife, arrow, back hit, and so on. This actually reveals the fact that these weapons were always there. They were frequently used, but just they were considered as unloyal weapons. That's just like a bit what the chivalric bias, at least from narrative sources, stems from. Probably in practice, we don't know the voices of these people. We don't know what they actually believed, right? Ideally, those weapons were kind of secondary. They were not, because, you see, it was a matter of status. The great warrior had a sword because it costed so freaking much. It meant the guy possessed serfs, slaves, and could make them work for having them dead, because he was strong and powerful and would cut them to pieces if they didn't do that. The average sacking serf, or the poorest Anglo-Saxon, would know how to use a bow. So there was nothing glorious, proud for the elite that wrote, that at least for the branch of it that went into clergy, that eventually would tell the deeds of these people, that would have to stress how beautiful it is to shoot a bow. Nobody cared, right? Because it also, tactically speaking, no army won because of bows, right? The bulk forces was always heavy infantry, and that's pretty much it, like in all sedentary realities. So the question, and properly even quantitatively speaking, you can have, to be effective, this arrow fire has to be pretty massive, right, quantitatively. And it probably was, right, but it was just an accompanying, a supporting weapon, right? The thing was resolved by infantry, by heavy infantry, by even heavy cavalry in part, here and there. So, yeah, the average Thane was probably familiar with the bow as a weapon of the hunt, as we've seen, and he maybe, since he was a bit more specialized into heavier combat, might have properly used it less in war, but that doesn't mean he would have not been skilled to use it, and that he wouldn't actually do. So stay sharp for bows, because they're always there in a way or another. Bows of the longest type could be even 6 feet long this period, so it's perfectly normal. People were a bit shorter than today, but usually these were kind of athletes, giants, right, for those time standards, and they would use it for hunting, make a lot of training. But they, as we were saying before, we don't find a specific issuing of let's say mandatory training for them, because they did. There was no properly enough royal power or social interest, like, I don't know, in the 14th century to doctrinally develop a kind of tactic involving the bow, as it would happen. The preferred woods were yew or ash for the stave, and poplar or beech for the arrows. The stave was either cut from the center of a tree trunk or worked from a branch of desired shape and size. Arrow shafts were cut from thin shoots created by coppicing the appropriate certain preferred trees, and bowstrings were made of linen thread, looped and bound into a cord. Clothing of the average Anglo-Saxon warrior would consist of something more advanced than it was in the ancient times. Let's say they had surely more woolen cloth spun or on upright looms, and the Anglo-Saxons didn't quite change their clothing much. over time, and they mostly were of about 2.5 long by 1.5 meters wide, and we don't know concretely how they were made, but illustrations of the time show that the cloaks would be hung to about knee length, right? And also tunics, of course, that were made of woolen yarn, and they were worn usually belted at the waist in such a manner as to raise the hem to knee height, and where they were worn without belt, the hem would hang to the calves, right? And we don't actually know how the sleeves worked. Some scholars believe that the sleeves were very long, reaching down even the fingers, and then eventually in the warmer season they would simply be folded back to the wrist. Other scholars suggest that the rumpling that is showed in contemporary pictures is merely an artistic convention. Cloaks could be used also in combat to kind of, together with weapons, of course, to kind of divert hits, to confuse the enemy. It's a real thing, like we know even from much modern fencing. Also, the neck of the tunic had either a square or circular opening for the head, was reinforced with a placket, and was closed either by a drawstring, brooch, or bead. Anglo-Saxons usually wore trouser leggings. By the 10th century, we know that were separate leggings or hose becoming fashionable, sometimes allowed to hang loose around the ankles. Otherwise, there would be long fabric strips wound closely around the calf, also varying in nature. The shoes that were important things we are not very documented. In Anglo-Saxon times, they were known as sko or jesio, I believe, and switler in Old English. Most of them seems to have had a kind of a smooth sole, which probably they were very flexible, so they did allow some grip with the foot, but also it could be slippery on the ground. The best surviving examples we have are Scandinavian, that were fundamentally similar in the essentials. They were mostly made of cowhide, and I think that many warriors at this time would even be able to fight still barefooted in some circumstances. So they simply had a different physical approach to reality than today's, right? With even fighting barefoot, it's the first 2 weeks you're destroyed in pain, but then eventually the skin adapts, it thickens, and as you go with that, right? That's how humans are meant to be, even just naturally speaking. But of course, at this point, also the shoes were more kind of comfortable and available. Belts were made of leather. They were usually not more than an inch wide, and they had. Speaking of headgear, Anglo-Saxon manuscripts of the later period show us military men often wearing a cap with a characteristic forward drooping peak. Right, this is sort of Phrygian cap in nature. And it kind of became associated with the Anglo-Saxon warrior proper, right? And consider that here the illuminations actually received influences from Carolingian Byzantine types. So we don't actually understand what this Phrygian cap is, meant to be a symbol, maybe of status sometimes, etc. But we rely mostly on manuscript evidence, and it's a bit more of a kind of philological problem than actual, actually an archaeological one. And interestingly enough, these caps are shown often in illustrations of battles as well, right? They might have had a some protective capacity if they had been made of leather, for example. So it might have been also, merely comfortable fatigue hats, right? Also made of wool or felt. So, but naturally, head protection is a big deal in combat. Most troops would have difficulty of having, metal helmets and so on. So probably, why not? Even a leather defense might have been something. So speaking of the average Anglo-Saxon warrior, ethos, well, it's kind of a bit difficult to generalize because of the increasing social stratification of the Anglo-Saxons, and the different phases proper of Anglo-Saxon history in strategically wise. Anglo-Saxon England was very different from the one of the Viking era, and let's say different ways even of summoning the army and changes occurred, as we were explaining in the Anglo-Saxon organization video. The average Anglo-Saxon warrior would mostly fight in a clanic unit that would be, in fact, summoned from places where he lived, and they were essentially arrayed into these greater units on the field, major divisions of hundreds, sometimes even thousands of men that would be lined up and then sent against the enemy line as well. Movements were slow because collective training wasn't a big deal. The best equipped troops would be deployed in the front, the others following. We don't know much about the depth, but let's say of the formation, we're talking about 8-10 ranks deep, something like that. They would exchange javelins at each other before the charge, but also during combat. It could be, I think, either the same spear or a spare javelin if you had it, and they would, of course, be provided with some kind of military experience and training, especially when the select field was called. Conflictuality in Anglo-Saxon England was high, right? Especially in the phase, however, when, in fact, England was more fragmented politically speaking, so also armies were smaller. During the Viking era, we see a greater organization there, and surely the internal hierarchy increased, right, in importance for maintaining control, order. Thanes at that point began to have this more specific, also organizational importance and training importance. However, the field never went beyond the semi-professional levy, and in the best of cases, and let's say the field was rarely summoned like at its fullest, right? So it was always a part of the eligible militiamen that would go to war. I don't know whether for Anglo-Saxon England there is any evidence of the rotation of the rota system for who had to go to war or not, but this would be, it's pretty safe to say it existed in a way. But also there were certain specific families, etc., that, as we've seen in case of the Thanes, also tended to let's say, take on the title generationally, so to become de facto semi-professionals, at least individually. Also, as single warriors, properly professional, because they would deal with this kind of things, but also not being, being there. Important differences within the Thanes as well, right? Some were richer than others, and so on. So it really depends. Also, consider that from the end of the 10th century to 1066, the Anglo-Saxons didn't have the opportunity to acquire large-scale military experience. So these are important aspects as well. And naturally, it's difficult to say how long the tribal ethos remained. It was a thing, right? From in a clanic sense, it's obvious that the southeast kind of civilized quicker, right? In places like Northumbria, I don't know, the tribal, individualistic, warlike, charismatic edicts remained the longest, right? But they also had less, organizational capacities, and that's why they compensated like that still. So the most interesting things definitely happen in Wessex between the 9th, the 10th century, right? As we have explained on in the other video. I don't know, there is some spread also of Christian values in all this, right? That, as we've seen, were often mixed with still pagan ones. It would be typical battle cries such as ut, ut, which in Old English means out, out. Also, Christianly speaking, Godamite. I don't know whether it's pronounced like this, that is God Almighty, and Holy Cross, so the Holy Cross. And think about the Barritos of the late imperial sources, right, that both the Germans and the legionnaires use. Battle cries would be important for boosting. And the internal cohesion of the units would mostly be based on clienterly connections, as we've seen. They were a bit familiar, a bit clanic, a bit properly, at some point, territorially based, with the increasing capacity of collective military organization, etc. So this is very varied, also depending on the places and times, right? And I think for now we can stop here. This was just about properly the Anglo-Saxon, the more proper Anglo-Saxon phase, right? Before the Norse influence in military organization essentially taking over the Anglo-Saxon system in a way, or at least superseding it, right, and becoming more prevalent with the Huscarls and so on, right? And all this should always, however, make us think mostly about the beliefs of these people, right? It was very important here still the connection with the idea of the brotherhoods of warriors, properly the religious meaning of the battle. There was still a ferocious ethics in mind. For example, the idea of burying the dead, right? Normally, we know in the early Germans, Tacitus says that they would bring out their fallen even during the battle, so losing precious time in that regard because they were scared, frightened of the warrior not to receive the proper burial. In Anglo-Saxon England, we find sometimes that the winning side would leave the corpses of the slaughtered enemy on the field without burying them, essentially to stress their own authority acquired like that. Because if nobody came to recover the corpses, it meant they had, the enemy army had been annihilated, right? So the corpses could remain there for years, their skeletons, the remains, to prove the fact that those were dead and buried there, that nobody had come, there was no political interest to recover them. These things were wild. For example, there is the poem of the Battle of Brunanburh that says at some point, they left behind them corpses for the dark, black-coated raven, horny-beaked to enjoy, and for the eagle, white-backed and dun-coated, the greedy war-hawk, and the grey wild beast, the forest wolf. Right? These are all necrophagous animals, symbols of Odin, and or let's say other the deity of war proper. And there is, I don't know, in Sutton Hoo, there's a shield plate that is a beautiful crow. Also inserted it in here. It's fascinating to watch. And it would be interesting to extend this description also to the later Anglo-Saxon, better Anglo-Danish period that we'll do on another occasion. We'll probably talk about the Anglo-Saxon warrior in that moment, right? And we could add tons of things, so surely at some point we will come back on these topics. This was just like most videos we make today as an introduction, telling you the truth. And for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.